All right, so that was Clip Genie on The Terror Factory. So, this is the third clip of the evening. Oh my goodness, this is my favorite. Really, I put the clips together and it's a whole story. It's all right there. So, it's like a mini documentary. It's pretty awesome. I noticed early on in the Grand Theft World series that Richard Grove had a particular seething hatred for the East India Trading Company.
I hated her so much. Flames on the side of my face.
His inner rage was quite strong to my psychic eye. So much so, I wondered if Richard had fought against the East India Trading Company in a past life.
In the 17th century, European powers created East India companies. These powerful companies were to dominate the highly profitable trade of silk, spices, tea, and other valuable imports. East India companies were nations within nations, taking over local towns and building large commercial centers. Having their own fleets and armies, rival companies often used war as extension to diplomacy. Now, it is time for you to take charge.
So in the late 1800s, and the Rothschilds had farms in Ceylon off the coast of India where, yeah. So the opium and then the money laundering around all the opium, that's where all the big banks come from, like Hong Kong, Shanghai Bank Corporation, HSBC, that donated millions and millions of dollars to Hillary Clinton and was doing drug money laundering and stuff like that. That goes back to Lord Palmerston and the British East India Company and the opium. Right. So there's a continuity of history, an ominous continuity, as Gatto would say. And we have to learn about this before we all get subjugated by it. It hasn't stopped. Not at all. It's fucking ticking.
Like you can follow this the whole way up to the modern day, and it's still ongoing. That's what's crazy about this. Isn't just a timestamp in history, just to use it as an analogy to what's happening today. No, it's still literally kind of ongoing. So it's kind of, people should really look into that. It really is like a Rosetta Stone.
Cool. Any other comments, questions, concerns?
I just wanted to pop in and say that the idea of an addiction-based economy, even though it's sort of, I don't know, I first started hearing about it with social media, and even the Social Dilemma documentary was kind of news to me, but it realizing, as you talk about the British East India Company, this model of getting people hooked on something seems to go back really far historically. I don't know.
Cod. It goes back to cod too. Cod was a food source. It was used as a currency in early proto-American times. There's a book on it I just read a couple weeks ago that my buddy Dylan, his dad, gave it to me. And he's like, check this out. They were using it in their trade. You could trade cod for slaves. It was a type of currency in the time, just like molasses and all these other parts of the. We're taught one aspect of triangle trade. So finally, the Europeans are like, hey, how do we get our gold and silver back from that country that doesn't want to trade with us? And the British Empire was like, And the East India Company has a predecessor that we could point out. Prior to the English or the East India Company of Great Britain, there was a predecessor trading company. There's a couple different ones. There's also the Dutch East India Company. But it's the British one that subjugated the nation of China for over 100 years with opium addiction. So when the Rockefellers pick up on the British project in the 20th century, the British have already subjugated China, through opium addiction and subjugation through military might for over 100 years, that the Chinese called their century of humiliation. So the Rockefeller Foundation is not acting outside of the British Empire's purview to use these types of techniques and these mechanisms for invisible government that's talked about with Bernays and Lippmann throughout the world for a long, long time. So I could look up, or we could do a thing during the week, and we could deep dive into the East India Company, the opium, the Anglo-American families on the American side, the Skull and Bones fortune. Like, who funded Skull and Bones? It's the Russell Trust Company. What did Russell Trust Company do? They smuggle opium. What did John Jacob Astor and his company trade furs for in China? Opium. Hierarchy. And it seemed like the Scandinavian monarchies got all this stuff running before we even thought to read history. So before the East India Company, there was the Dutch East India Company, and some of those, there's several very, very powerful families. They own Royal Dutch Shell, right? So there was like Royal, and then the Dutch Shell part, that's Rothschild with the monarchy. So there is actually, now that you say that, because I think that's not Sweden, but that's Netherlands. Royal Dutch Shell is
Scandinavian, though, and I went to the Royal Palace while I was there in Sweden, and they still have a royal family.
Yeah, and what most people don't understand also outside of the monarchy part was in the United States, the Rockefellers monopolized oil, and then they became bankers. And in Europe, the Rothschilds started out in banking and then got into oil with the Nobel brothers, who were the Rockefellers of Europe. So there's a whole piece of history we're not even told about. This would not be the last time in the 1920s that expression was given to fears about Anglo-American elites attempting to subvert the United States' independence. So that's one of the examples. But I was interested in, as early as the 1920s, there are people figuring out, wait, why are we getting so close with our former enemy, Britain? And from that aspect going forward, it's like if you break into a chronological study of how this unfolded over time, it does. It starts at the American Revolution, and you have to understand who the British Empire is, who the East India Company was, what their trade was, why they dumped the tea, and then you got to move forward with all the other things you need. And so I just kept finding questions and finding books and what's the earliest copy, or somebody would mention it in a footnote, and I'd have 10 books I have to get. And that went on from like 2003 until like 2010 before I started really outputting. It was 2009 as the Peace Revolutions when I started outputting it. They're starting to realize Trudeau's not representing them. He's the proxy from the Queen in their country to rule over them. Like we're watching some Frontier series on Netflix with Jason Momoa. Because how the East India Company, that's the Hudson Bay Company in that series. Yeah. They're very similar operations. You can see
the same sort of.
They clearly care about the people. Having the artifact, or even some of these earlier pre-Carol Quigley books I have over here, Porter Sargent on education and war, and the fact that our schools were being changed to get into a war mentality, and that according to this Pilgrim Society book right here, they were changing the attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs of people in the 1920s to be more pro-British through changing American history books. So this ties back into maybe that selling war topic that you opened up with, James, where there's a group who has a superior set of experience to a nascent America who didn't in the 20th century have their own intelligence network. The East India Company's intelligence network, the British Empire's intelligence network, MI6, like it goes back in history, and there's a lot of evidence of how it evolved over time and why it evolved over time too. And America got sucked into that, and before you knew it, we were playing in the Great Game, which is another whole great idea. There's a ton of books on that concept and the new great game that they're seeking to play with us right now in this great reset. Yeah, it started with the British East India Company and Thomas Malthus about 4 hours ago. That's where we talked about the infiltration. I followed it chronologically, but I started in Britain. So I started with GCHQ, and I started with MI6 and how did MI6 come about. And then MI6 starts working with organized crime well before America even has intelligence. MI6 was working organized crime internationally because that's kind of what they did. They were a front for the East India Company. Like the old money transitioned into let's create intelligence and governments and these sort of things. So moving forward, so it's Operation Underworld. 1938 starts in the UK, but we get into that same thing 1942 because we're in the special relationship. And what Britain is showing us is, hey, welcome to the intelligence world. We deal humans and arms and drugs and all these sorts of things. Historically, this is how we have power, and we want you to be the next in line and be our property managers. So we're going to help you create OSS and CIA. And then while inside this country, we see it as CIA, mafia, maybe a couple other groups had motives on Kennedy, but there were international motives on Kennedy. The British hated the Kennedys because they're Irish. They hated that Joe Kennedy was ambassador to the UK. Well, it was really embarrassing in Britain when they figured out slavery was evil, but then they're like the entire British opium conglomerate of the East India Company is based on
That's
slavery.
why they renamed it and called them indentured servants in India.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Changed the words and made it okay for a while, right?
Exactly.
Then they had a code of ethics, and this was called the Davos Manifesto. So this is what they're getting together to do. And the people that bring you the Great Reset today, it's not the first time they all got together and did anything. I just wanted to share because, James, you, among few people on this planet, you might know who Prince Bernard was and what he had to do, or even Aurelio Pucce, who sounds like a very nice guy. What are people missing in that? What aren't they saying?
Well, what sticks out to me is, of course, it always goes back to Malthus with these people. Always goes back to Malthus, who, of course, for people who don't know, has ties to the British East India Company that I'm not going to be able to rattle off the top of my head.
He taught at the British East India Company College.
Right. And exactly, people know him as a pastor or a father or whatever. No, he was a British East India agent.
This comes from chapter 16 in Buckminster Fuller's Universe by Lloyd Seiden. Thomas Malthus was an economist and a professor at the East India Company College, just outside of London, the one institution charged with educating all the civil servants managing the British Empire's global holdings. The East India Company College also became the sole repository for global information gathered by British citizens and civil servants around the world. His access to such a multitude of data made Malthus the first person to study a comprehensively complete inventory of the world's vital and economic statistics. Using that data in 1798, he wrote the classic work, An Essay on the Principle of Population, which he revised in 1803. Those elaborate dissertations documented the fact that the human population was increasing far more rapidly than the relatively scarce production of life-supporting goods and services. From that data, Malthus concluded that the scarcity of goods that people experienced would increase unless something was done to curb the rising population. So it's a good argument, 1798. It's a lot of interesting history. You have to learn a lot of context to be able to understand those situations, but basically it works like this. India is a region, and they have Hinduism, and then Pakistan's a region, and there's a lot of Muslims there, and the British have been messing with both and putting them at war with each other for a long time. So yeah, the politics are pretty deep over there. It also ties in with the Afghan war and the opium trade and the East India Company's long history of abuses there.
David Sassoon, Anglo-Indian merchant, head of the House of David Sassoon and Company, quote, the Rothschilds of the East, end quote, born at Baghdad, 1817, died in Brighton, England, October 24th, 1896, eldest son of David Sassoon. Wow. And
then you go to David Sassoon's entry. And so when they're called the Rothschilds of Baghdad, and then they later marry with the Rothschilds. They're like, we might as well just marry with them. And now you've got a banking conglomerate and an opium conglomerate from the British East India Company's supply line.
Vidal Sassoon London and all our salons worldwide, we've worked with enough hair to know that fine hair, like Jackie's, needs something extra.
Vidal Sassoon, if you don't look good, we don't look good.
All working together before Cecil Rhodes even comes along. What do you got?
Holy shit. It says business career. This is just on the wiki, which has whitewashed most of that information you just presented, which is...
Yeah. Because the Sassoons were the opium magnates out of Baghdad, Iraq, and that's the other lineage in his family, which I thought was interesting because So if you follow the family tree of the Rothschilds and their international banking interests, you get here. And then if you look at the East India Company, you got this other segment, and it depends on the Sassoon family, which were the opium magnates of Baghdad, Iraq. Right now, British American involvement in Iraq since then, very, very heavy. So you got the Sassoons. And I knew if I kept waiting in the history, eventually they were going to intermarry. And sure enough, they did around the 1870s. I think it was Albert Sassoon. Actually, I have a history blueprint. Let's go over here because I'm pretty sure the Sassoons are in here. S-A-S-S. Sassoon family. Look at this. And then getting into this, there's so David Sassoon was the dude, and he marries into the Rothschild family. He becomes a British citizen, and this is documented. Albert Abdullah David Sassoon is the son of David Sassoon, and he is an opium warlord monopoly guy. This guy's in charge of Baghdad, Iraq. He's in charge of the opium trade. He works with the East India Company.
Doesn't the Sassoon family correspond or connect with, is it not Rudyard Kipling? It's the Flemings? The Flemings?
Well,
or something like that?
You're close, Tony, because they do.
Jardine Fleming?
Yes. So here comes
like
the Sassoon.
Sorry.
So David Sassoon is part of the Sassoon family. Now you can go to the Jewish Encyclopedia and read all about this, because that's where I learned about all this history of the Sassoon family. They have a wonderful archive of history on this character, David Sassoon. So you go to David Sassoon, 1792 to 1864, and then he has a son. And then at one point, I think it's this one. Let's go back. David Sassoon, opium. All right. So there's Jardine Matheson. Here's the connections off to the side, right? So David Sassoon, I think it's his son or grandson, marries into the Rothschild family, like in the 1860s, right? So now you have a connection between the East India Company's opium monopoly and the Rothschild family post Waterloo in a way that involves marriage. Now, how does this trickle down today? Dope Inc., Britain's opium war against the world. See that syringe on the front? It doesn't look like heroin in that. What is that? Is that morphine, or is it? Not sure. Here's another copy. The earlier version was subtitled "The Book That Drove Kissinger Crazy." You know why it's got all these red marks in here? Because the story is that the British East India Company's opium monopoly got handed over to Kissinger Associates. And then if you put in L. Paul Bremer of Marsh & McLennan and Kissinger Associates being the paymaster over in Iraq as they made a new country during the Second Iraq War, then you might start making a lot more sense out of the world and how it really works, because it ain't like they show you on the television. That's the control box. This is the freedom box. You see, this is how to get out of the box, actually, reading books like Dope Inc.
How you doing in there?
Ugh. I'm tired.
Oh, shit. I've got jury duty.
What?
No. How could this happen? We're paid in cash. We don't do taxes.
I don't even have a driver's license.
Our credit cards are through a third party.
Oh, I voted once.
You what?
I voted for Dukakis.
Dukakis?
It was before I turned, and I was just thinking about the good of the country.
Country? It's just business. From the Dutch West India Company to the slave trade.
How do you know all this stuff?
The History Channel.
Something maybe we might should know British about. East India Company. Something maybe we might should know about. Operation Mockingbird. Something maybe we might should know about. Operation Paperclip. Something maybe we might should know about. Ruby Ridge. Something maybe we might should know about. Opium Wars. Something maybe we might should know about. Before you can take the power back, I don't know where the power's at. Tragedy and hope. Before you can take the power back, I don't know where the power's at. Tragedy.